people trying to set goals before they even know what goals should be, right? Like
Yeah.
you're really early, whether it's a project at a later stage company or you're early on, people are like, oh, we should set this goal for 6 months out. But they literally have no historical knowledge about whether that's a realistic goal or not. So for those that are listening, Michael Katz is CEO and founder of mParticle, currently based in New York, and previously founder of Interclick.
Yep.
When we first met, 2014, 2015, mobile was still it hadn't surpassed desktop, but you could tell that's where the trajectory was going.
Yeah.
But it's funny now to think back and see how seemingly early that actually was.
Oh my God.
Even though mobile had been around forever.
Totally. Remember, people would debate, like, who's going to win? Is it web or is it app? And, like, one had to win, one had to lose. Facebook went all in on HTML5, and then they had to walk it back. And, like, in hindsight, now everything is, like, super obvious. But the primary, like, debate or discussion was, like, one had to win and one had to lose, and you had to pick a side. And it was like, what are we talking about here? So, like, that happened a lot in the ad tech space in the 2000s, where, like, these two things were pitted against each other, and it was like you had to pick. It was like all on one or none on the other, or all on the other and none on one. And it never really plays out that, like, it makes for a good discussion and, like, fun headlines and, like, some controversial panels at conferences and shit like that. But it's like there is a lot of middle ground in which we build businesses and live our lives.
It's pretty interesting because now that I think back to 2014 when we were first starting, one of the questions was, would people be willing to transact e-commerce at a large scale on mobile and inside of mobile apps? They're like, oh, it's a tiny screen. Seems like no one's going to be willing to spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars on that. And it's true. Like, at the time, people were reluctant to spend more than maybe like $20. Yeah. But now people will purchase thousands of dollars of things just on their phone sitting on their couch because they don't want to take out their computer.
Stupid shit too, stuff that they shouldn't buy, like NFTs. That's right. It's crazy how the pendulum has swung from, like, the most ubiquitously used device across the world, right? And people are like, well, will you do this, that, or the other thing, to, hey, we're just going to throw money at this, like, Web3 thing because it sounds like a good pitch, and this is clearly, it must be the future since 3 is higher than 2, and Web2, I don't know. Like, we just got real dumb real quick. I guess that's what, like, a 14-year boom cycle will do, but yeah, it is funny to see that evolution.
It's wild, actually, the real dumb real quick. But I feel like that's cyclical, and that tends to happen, and then things reset.
Yeah.
Periodic.
Totally.
It is hard in the moment, though, to really decipher what's quality, what's the future, and what's maybe speculative or the hype. Because even, talking about 2013, 2014, we didn't necessarily know. You had to take a bet. You had to have conviction, say mobile's the future, apps are going to continue to be around, HTML5 is not going to replace apps, all that sort of stuff. But we didn't know. And even now,
never know.
With crypto and Web3, we don't know.
No, and, I think that there's so much of this, like, narrative bias that gets applied where it's like, oh, I knew and I took these 3 or 4 steps. It's like, no, you didn't. That's not what happened. I know the ins and outs of, like, how messy these decisions are made, and a lot of the times you just have to an leap of faith. And most things start out either with a leap of faith or such an optimistically painted view that it borders on just, like, being an outright lie, and then it becomes a reality, right?
Outright, yeah. The borders on being a lie or just as naivety, right? Like, I'm a big believer that when you start a company, you almost have to be naive as, to the real world and the true nuances of what you're getting yourself into.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, because if you know too much, if you've seen too much and you get in your own head and you start talking about why things won't work, you can become very reductionist really, really easily. And that never works. So you need like that ignorance. Like ignorance is an asset when you're starting a business, because if you have all of the answers in front of you and you know that the odds are stacked against you, and you have like a clear understanding of like how much fucking work it's going to take to actually get the thing to where you want it to be, like who in their right mind would start businesses?
Yeah, you wouldn't. I think there's probably a combination. You need to be naive to not kind of truly understand the depth that you need to go, how much work needs to go into it. But you also need to be really optimistic and really have a belief that something's going to be big.
Totally. Yeah.
Which is a hard combination of things to have.
It is, and it's also important that optimism can't be completely unbounded, right? So you need like eternal optimism, but you need to be this like cynical optimist, right? Where you can still poke holes in your ideas. You can still be somewhat objective, but you're always looking at things as opportunities.
Yeah. How important do you think it is that people have like a deep kind of unwavering passion in something if they're thinking about starting a company?
I think it's so much, right? Like think about all the ups and downs you guys have had, all the ups and downs we've had over the ups and downs that are inevitable over a decade plus long journey.
Yeah.
There's going to be everything thrown at you. And if you don't love what you're doing, if you're not doing it for the pursuit, like the pursuit has to be happiness. And if it's not, if it's something you're excited about because you feel like you can make a bunch of money, or it's something you're excited about because of the outcome or the reward at like the other end of things, I think that one, that's really dangerous. And then two, the other thing I see from time to time is people will say like they'll time bound it, and they'll say like, I'm going to do this for 5 years or 7 years or whatever. And you may build a company that's on a good trajectory, but there probably won't be an outcome, like a well-defined outcome in 5 years or 7 years, or maybe even 10, right? Like we're on year 10, like we're still on a great trajectory, and there's no outcome in kind of plain view. We're got to keep building. And if you tell yourself, I only have like a defined period of time that I'm going to do this for, I feel like you start to come up against like the finality of that, and then you're just burnt. So you have to manage your energy over a very, very long period of time.
Yeah. And I think you tend to make suboptimal decisions too when you're time bound, because you're forcing everything into that. There can be, I guess, good aspects to it, but if you're thinking about it from an outcome perspective and wanting to achieve some outcome, that's a lot of that isn't necessarily within your control.
I think as we get older and wiser, we realize just how very little is actually in our control.
Yeah. Yeah, it is pretty. You like to think that a lot is, and there's certain things. The inputs are within your control a lot of times, but the outputs aren't necessarily within your control.
Yeah. Like, but even still, I would argue that the inputs are mostly in your control. Your understanding of them is probably not going to be 100% accurate. It may be like directionally right. And what's really most important is like how fast you can learn and iterate and either like evolve or optimize from there. Because if you try to like boil down the world into like absolute terms, like the world is it's probabilistic. It's not entirely deterministic. Like there's an element of people, right, which just makes things really, really unpredictable, because people aren't rational always. They're emotional, right? And so how you approach things oftentimes evolves based on what you anticipate others' reactions to be, based on whatever their motivations are. But those things aren't always like completely well defined or understood, and it's one of those things where you can only kind of plan so much. You just have to plan to iterate.
Yeah, and it's one of the key learnings I've had, and I think it's super important for any founder, which is you can guess or have a hypothesis, but the biggest thing that you can do is just have fast iteration.
That's right.
Because you pick a direction, generally you're going here. Generally we're going north, get a little bit down the trail, and then you realize, oh, we need to pivot. We need to adjust this direction or just how we're doing something. And I think too often they want to solve everything or want to have all the answers before they even start.
Yeah.
And I found that the better answer is, as long as you know your general direction, start, and then just be comfortable iterating and evolving over time, like you're saying.
Yeah, I agree. And this is actually like, I don't know if you guys use like OKRs at Branch, but this is one of my problems with like OKRs. Like people spend a bunch of time defining what's the objective, and then like what are the key results. And what I've found is like, because they put in a bunch of time and they're proud of what they come up with, the year always plays out in kind of like weird ways, and they need to be adapted continually. But people are scared to make that adaptation because it's almost like an admission of like being wrong in a way, right? And so building that ability to deal with ambiguity and comfort with change, I feel like is so critically important, because it does become really easy for organizations, especially ones that experience a good amount of success, to become almost like victim to the inertia that is created as a result of that success. Because they're like two sides of the same coin, right? There's momentum and then there's inertia. And so trying to change things, trying to change that trajectory, if it's not like deeply entrenched in your culture, is almost impossible, because people have like tons of biases. Like loss aversion is real.
Yeah. I think that's one of the challenging things with leading a group of people towards the goal is that ambiguity, getting them to a place where they're comfortable in the ambiguity, because people typically, they want that high level goal. You can give them the mission, you can give them the vision, you can give them, the annual goals that we have.
Yeah.
But then I found people also like to see more granularly, how are we going to get there? And to some degree you need it. But I think that combination of knowing that you won't have all the answers, you won't know all the things you need to be doing, but also adaptability.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think people think about process. Like when people hear the word process, they think, oh, that's bad. And my view is like, process when implemented to like mitigate risk is like really what people think of when they think about like annoying process. Process to like facilitate success and growth is actually really important. And it's not about not allowing people to do certain things, but it's about drawing boundaries around whatever problem they're trying to solve or whatever they're trying to achieve, and saying, this is the process for how you have to get there. But within that box, within that playing field, so long as you're in bounds, like have at it.
So how do you guys think about setting the objectives and giving people enough information and goals while also maintaining adaptability at mParticle?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and so I have some ideas I'll share. I don't, I'll preface it by saying I don't know if they're good ideas or bad ideas. Like they're almost experiments I want to run. But one of the things that I see is, especially with OKRs, is like what gets lost is, as startups, like it's always a race against time until you're profitable or have so much money in the bank where like it doesn't matter. But even then, like you're always racing against time to make sure you're not getting out innovated or out distributed. And, I think making sure that people understand not just the snapshot in time, but the trajectory, I think is one of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently. And so rather than having a lot of these like status meetings where people just kind of like come in, it's like a structured, well-organized like show and tell. Hey, here's what I'm working on. Here's what's working. And it's like that every week or every month or whatever. But it's always a snapshot. I think asking, and it starts with having like a really strong director and VP layer, forcing them to come with trends and hypotheses, right? And what that does is it forces them to own the information and to own the understanding of how to connect the dots, not just saying, here's what I'm doing this week, here's what I'm doing this week, and then leaving it for like the executives to connect those dots. Yeah. So I think that's definitely one thing I've been thinking about, and then making sure that there's like, it's not just like the key results that are defined, but it is those like those mile markers and understanding the when, like what is the sequence? Because without that, I feel like you can get people who show up to, whether you're again on like a weekly cadence or monthly or quarterly, show up and say like, oh yeah, things are good, and it's like too subjective, and it's like it's a little bit too squishy. Like you wanna be able to effectively like TQM your whole trajectory. Like you want to break it down into really small intervals. So if things start to get off track, if the rocket starts veering off, a degree or 2 degrees, it may not feel like a lot at the onset. It will end up being a lot over time, but you need those mechanisms in place to be able to surface that, because like when it's just about that like high level objective and then like a bunch of kind of things that ladder up to it in this like semi ambiguous way, you don't really know.
Yeah. I think the trends piece is really interesting. Because I think you're right. Often you see a snapshot and you say, this looks good or bad, or here's it relative to where we thought we were going to be. But it's really that shape of the curve, irrespective of what the y-axis is, right? Like,
that's right.
What is it going towards? Is it converging or diverging from where we thought we'd be?
That's right.
And it's really interesting. One of the other big things that I related to goals and goal setting, especially in early stage companies that I see, is people trying to set goals before they even know what goals should be, right? Like you're really early, even whether it's a project at a later stage company or you're early on, people are like, oh, we should set this goal for 6 months out. But they literally have no historical knowledge about whether that's a realistic goal or not. How do you think about setting goals for things that are just new or unknown? Or how did you set goals in the early days? Or did you not, right? That's the other approach, which is we're just going to measure, but not have any goals tied to it because we don't know where to set the goals.
In the earliest days, the goals were like survival, right? I'm talking like post like raising your seed round on the idea. What you're really trying to get to is like get enough traction to raise the Series A. And I don't think you need to be overly concerned with goal setting and like having the proper frameworks. It's just like, don't fucking die. That's the goal. And then I think that there's like, probably after your Series A, maybe your Series B, depending on like the markets that you raise in, the opportunity, all that kind of stuff. After one of those, you probably need to start introducing ways to plan for the business and connect that with the way that the business is run. So your systems of planning and your systems of governance you need to start to connect those dots. And I would say like certainly by like Series D, like those systems need to be like fairly well fleshed out. And the way I think about it is like you have your, call it 2 or 3 year goal, and I think like everybody has like different views. Like should it be 2? Should it be 3? Like whatever. Just more longer than 1 year. And then so that's kind of like that's like ground zero. Then you create the plan for like next year. And ultimately you're saying like what do I want to accomplish? Like what am I going to stop doing? What do I need to do more of? What can I carry forward from like the previous year? What assumptions can I make? And then you figure out like the delta, right? And then that becomes like the hiring plan, right? And then you craft somewhere in the middle of all that, like the strategic plan that ends up getting rolled out. Now, I think where like a lot of companies fail is like that process ends, and then it's like, all right, let's go back to just like operating.
Yeah.
And if you're not incorporating that into like, say, if you do like a weekly or monthly all hands, if you're not incorporating progress against those goals in the strategic plan in the team meetings, if the output from the team meetings isn't surfacing risks, or flip side of that would probably be like leverage and opportunities, and creating those like those feedback loops effectively. I don't know why bother doing like any of it. So yeah, you need to create the goals, but you need to also create the connective tissue between those like systems of planning and systems of governance.
Yeah, I think we started probably later than we should have at every all hands, hitting on the top 6 metrics that we had for the company. And then in team meetings, you can trickle down the other objectives or goals.
Yeah.
But you're right about incorporating that progress so that people can see what that trend is.
Yeah.
Probably like a later stage thing. Well, I guess you can do that in the early stages as well.
Yeah.
You talked about in the seed stage, you're just fighting for survival.
Yeah.
But when you're in that stage, you also need to be, I'd imagine, measuring things to make sure that you're at least on track for survival. How do you think about that, of making sure that you're measuring the right things that are indicators, leading indicators maybe, of future success or survival?
Yeah, and that's why I had prefaced it by saying like it kind of depends on like the market that you're raising in. Like if you're building a consumer product, that's obviously going to be different than like a B2B business. And then even like B2B, if you're going more of like a bottoms up motion, survival for you may just be like adoption, right? Because monetization will come. But if you're more enterprise focused, it's clearly about like the revenue that you're producing. So I think it's like it's context specific is what I would say.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see over the last couple of years the bottom up versus top down approach too, because like Monday.com and a lot of these companies, Notion's been doing very well with a bottom up approach. You guys took more of a top down and enterprise motion approach from the early days, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
We did.
Or if you were, how about this? If you were starting mParticle today, or if you were redoing it, would you stick with that same motion, or would you do it differently?
I would definitely do it differently, actually.
What would you do instead?
Well, let me just explain like why we went that route. That was like that go to market and selling to large marketers, a solution that could help them better utilize their first party data assets. Like, Interclick was a very different business because it was in the ad tech space, but we built Interclick on the success of the data platform that we built. So we gained a really strong appreciation for how companies and how business users think about utilizing their first-party data assets for the purpose of generating outcomes, ultimately. And I feel like there's an element of like founder market fit. There's also kind of an element of like go-to-market fit too. So like that's why it was like we were just trying to play to our strengths. And you know, the things that we've seen over the course of, you know, the past decade that lead me to say I would do it differently is that when you take a sales-led approach from day one, well, depending on how you do it, but like we didn't have a free trial or anything. And so I think we naturally and inadvertently constrained serendipity, right? So people coming to our site and checking out the product and becoming more familiar with it. When you think about two companies that start on the exact same day and one goes bottoms up and one goes top down, independent of like the early trajectory, over the course of time, the sheer number of people who will create accounts and log in and develop familiarity and recommend a product when you have the bottoms up approach, you create this like people centric network effect.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. I think by going bottoms up, which is to say like to be more product led, you have to let the UI and UX really guide the user. And when you're sales led and you're selling into big enterprises who not only want but need a bunch of hand holding, you can start to rationalize the quality of the UX and say like, it's good enough. We have our account managers or our SEs or like they know how to kind of navigate around like the weird stuff. But it kind of like lowers the bar in a way, in a not so great way too. And then lastly, which is kind of connected to the first point, when you have a much greater like breadth of customers, there's just more data, right? So you can start to model and anticipate and also test certain features, certain hypotheses. You have like just a much bigger petri dish to go and test stuff. And you can do that if you have a number of enterprise customers too, but you know, as you well know, like no two or like usually two enterprise customers who look the same don't think the same or want the same things. Yeah. And so you get a lot of this like data sparsity where you can't really connect the dots as well.
It's so there's no silver bullet. There's no like one way to do it. For people, like if I was starting a company today, when I think about it, what would I do? And I was talking to Adam Gross, the former CEO of Heroku, the other day, and he was saying he's got a great presentation on this too, on Heavy Bit. He was talking about, in the olden days, like truly in the 90s, it was on-prem. You had to go sales-led approach. You had to go top-down, sell to the CIO, CTO, CEO. And then in the 2000s, you could go kind of like team approach. And now you see a lot of the bottom-up PLG, product-led growth type of like selling to individuals, selling to people.
Yeah.
And he was talking about, he hit on the first part, which you mentioned, network effect, which I think is a really important part.
Yeah.
Of people moving companies around. If they go and discover mParticle today on their own, they use it and they like it, but they're bouncing to another company in 9 months. If they liked mParticle, they're going to bring mParticle to that other company.
Yeah.
So if you have 100,000 people that know about you and are using you versus 1,000, you're going to spread much more quickly into all these other companies.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think no matter what, at some point, every B2B company needs to build out a sales team and they need to embrace that. And I think like that's kind of the struggle that some companies end up having culturally, where sales feels like this foreign thing, or, you know, the image of like a used car salesman replaces like what sales really is. And it's this kind of like bastardization of like go to market. But, you know, at the same time, I mean, from a product standpoint, it's probably easier in many regards to go from enterprise more down market, because you have like we've invested a ton in our security posture. Like there's a reason why like Segment and Twilio keep having like data breaches, and we've never had one, right? Like that has to get built into the system design from like day zero. But from like a UX standpoint, like it's probably the inverse, right? Like, you know, sometimes our platform has been, well, I think it's a matter of preference, but if I'm being hypercritical, I think, you know, sometimes people will say like, some of the workflows are like a little bit clunky. And I think that that's just a byproduct of our heritage in terms of selling, to enterprise first versus being more product led. I don't know. Like I think the kind of key takeaway is like at some point you have to do both. What's the better starting point though?
Yeah, and I think it probably also depends. I agree in both. Like, yeah, and Adam Gross agreed too. He said you basically need to do both, and ideally you could do both at the same time, albeit that can be distracting.
Yeah,
I'd imagine it depends on whether you're a product that people will discover on their own, whether it's a known need that individuals will search for, that you might have some SEO traffic coming in, or if it's something that's so new and different that you actually need to go evangelize and create a market, which is a bit of a different.
Well, I think like there's always going to be that need for evangelism, because I think in any new opportunity, you're almost educating people on problems that they don't know that they have or don't fully appreciate quite yet. So I don't think that changes. I think that only actually becomes more important over time. I think though, that there's also a lot of false positives though with like the product led stuff. When I think about the companies that really nailed product led growth, like around our space, it wasn't just that they had a free trial and they did like a bunch of demand gen around it, right? Like to your point, they really did evangelize and they built community, right? Or they had this like open source thing that caught on like wildfire, and then people would go to the website and they would sign up for free. But there was always like that spark which drew people there that isn't possible with like your traditional like revenue marketing tactics. Like the biggest SDR team in the world won't get you there. The most elaborate demand gen program won't get you there. Like you got to be grassroots, getting in front of the people who are driving influence within whatever community you're hoping to be part of.
Yeah. The community approach is definitely a key aspect to kind of like that bottom up approach.
Yeah. I know you guys were huge on that in the early days.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time. So we started, if I were to think about it, we started more as a developer tool, but we always had this kind of two-pronged approach where we were going after high volume developer, bottom up, free usage, and also had some aspect of top down. Mm-hmm. But that was really emphasized later on. In the beginning, it was all community. It was doing meetups, hosting meetups for developers. We're heavy on Stack Overflow, created newsletters, just trying to offer content to the community. And then eventually we still do a lot of that.
Yeah.
But there's a heavy emphasis now on kind of top down or enterprise.
Yeah.
So, because that's really where, for us at least, the bulk of the revenue comes from.
I think that like the takeaway is that when you're trying to get traction, the most direct strategy isn't always like the best strategy.
Yeah.
You may want to think about like, how do I flank this opportunity from, a different angle? Because I don't know, sometimes when it's like, it's too direct, there's almost like, there's too much friction, or there's potentially like too much of like an entrenched set of like behaviors or competitors or whatever else. And so, I mean, that's the advice I typically give founders, like when I'm advising them. It's like, is there a more oblique or discrete way of getting to the end state? Because I know you want to build the next whatever, right? But if you say like, hey, I'm going to be the next whatever, it never works that way. Like, it never works that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree. The way I think about it is you almost need to add value in some other way. And you can't go in and say, yeah, we're that next thing. Yeah. We are the better version of this thing you already have or already use. But if you go in and add value in other ways over time, over a long enough time horizon, could be years.
That's right.
Eventually, then people will start to, you kind of nudge them in that direction and start to see, like, maybe I will check out that thing. What is it that they do? Okay. And we've seen great success there, whether it's content, whether it's meetups, communities, all that sort of stuff.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, from a ripple to a wave.
Yeah, I like that. In the final few minutes here, if it's kind of an interesting environment right now, 2023, it's, we've had a amazing, 10, 12 years of a lot of venture capital funding, low interest rates. Starting a company today is going to look fundamentally different than maybe 2013, 2014 when we started our companies. What advice would you have for somebody that's either early stage or kind of aspiring to start something and thinking about it?
I think it's a lot of the stuff that, we were talking about earlier. Your heart really has to be in it for the long haul. Regardless whether you start in a boom cycle or more of an economic slowdown, startups are at least the vast majority of them who have some bit of longevity are like, they're a decade at least, right? So, this is going to sound not all that profound, but like, make sure your heart is in it. Like, make sure that you really derive personal satisfaction from the pursuit. So I think I mentioned before we started talking, the pursuit is happiness. So one of my friends, Lupe Fiasco, I was having dinner with him like a few years back, and he said that, and it was like, yeah, I like that. But I think like the more I've thought about it over the course of like the past 4 or 5 years, it's so true, right? Like, if you don't get happiness from like the pursuit of whatever, of greatness, of business, of sports, of, fill in the blank. If the pursuit doesn't make you happy, like, what does?
I really love that. It's so easy to be focused on the outcome.
Yeah.
Like you were saying earlier. And if you're focused on the outcome, you're not going to, or it's going to be harder to go through the ups and downs over a decade or longer.
Oh, completely. Yeah, completely. And I think that, there's like natural kind of laws of attraction, right? Like the harder you try to pursue something, the tougher it becomes, right? So you have to focus on the inputs.
Love it. Love it. Awesome. Katz, really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your time today.